cousins of ours, many are not, and there are genuine differences in outlook. This is what makes Nagarjuna's work so exciting to read, and to think about it provides a genuinely distinctive perspective on a set of problems and projects that we share. In commenting on Nagarjuna's text, I am constantly aware of walking a philosophical and hermeneutical tightrope. On the one hand, one could provide a perfectly traditional commentary on the text, or better, a translation of one of the major Sanskrit or Tibetan commentaries, or a transcript of oral commentary by a recognized scholar of the tradition. Such a commentary would explain in great detail the way the text is seen from the perspective of its home tradition and the background of Buddhist controversies to which the text responds. A commentary like this would undoubtedly be of great use to Buddhologists and philosophers already steeped in Buddhist philosophy and its history. And indeed, Sprung's translation of most of Candrakirti's Prajnapada, lucid exposition, including the root verses from Mulamadhyamakarika, partially fulfills this need. But many of these scholars and students already have access to the relevant texts in their original languages or to teachers situated within the Buddhist tradition. On the other hand, one could try to comment on the text by presenting a theory of what Nagarjuna would have said had he been a 20th-century Western philosopher. One could then feel free to step back from the internecine debates in the classical Buddhist academy, which were so absorbing to the historical Nagarjuna and so distant from our own context, and simply ask how his arguments would be formulated in the context of the contemporary philosophical scene. Leaving aside the question of how one would identify the possible philosopher denoted by this bizarre counterfactual, this would again be a profoundly unsatisfying enterprise. For what makes this a great text is not simply that we can extrapolate its significance to our own context, but that in reading it, to borrow Gadamer's metaphor, we are able to fuse its textual horizon with our own. It is the bringing to the present of Nagarjuna's own concerns, insights, and arguments that is revelatory, not speculation about a related counterfactual nonentity. And for this fusion of interpretive horizons to be possible, we must, as much as possible, respect the original horizon of the text. Having said this, one must confess the double difficulty of giving sense to the phrase Nagarjuna's own concerns, insights, and arguments. The recovery of authorial intent as a hermeneutic task is problematic, especially when the author is so culturotemporally remote and when his corpus is as controversial in composition and interpretation as is Nagarjuna's. But it is equally problematic as a hermeneutic desideratum. For who is to say that Nagarjuna is the best possible interpreter of Mulamadhyamakarika? After all, he did not have the benefit of the long commentarial tradition he spawned. A great text, or, as Gadamer has referred to such texts, an eminent text, grows over time and merits reinterpretation and rereading as the tradition in which it participates develops and provides an ever-expanding context for its reading. Moreover, I am reading Nagarjuna largely through the lens of the Tibetan commentarial tradition and through the Tibetan translation of his text, the text read and discussed by the scholars of this long, deep, and intellectually diverse and rich tradition, few of whom had access to Sanskrit. So the Nagarjuna whose views I am exploring is an evolving figure, rooted in the life and writing of a 1st or 2nd century Indian monk, of whom we know but little, but whose literary life and identity extends through a complex, sophisticated, and contested textual and philosophical tradition in India and Tibet and in the West. As a consequence, in interpreting this text on the middle path for a Western audience, I have sought insofar as possible to find a middle path between these extremes. I have tried to explain Nagarjuna's own arguments and their context as straightforwardly as possible without burdening the Western philosophical reader with extended discussion of the specifically ancient Indian Buddhist philosophical debates. I have indicated ways in which very specific arguments can be generalized and have commented on general structural features of arguments, chapters, and the text. I have throughout explained arguments in Western philosophical terms, while situating those arguments in their Buddhist context. There may be times when my desire to make arguments accessible has led to some distortion in Nagarjuna's sense. There may also be times at which, by leaving arguments set firmly within the soteriological context of Buddhism, I have left those arguments looking like curios to my Western audience. Some of this may be unavoidable, but in any case I have sought specifically to minimize these difficulties. The interpretation I offer is situated squarely within a Prasangika, Madhyamaka interpretation of Nagarjuna, the philosophical school that reads Mulamadhyamakarika through the commentaries of Buddhapalita and Candrakirti. But more specifically, my reading is heavily influenced by the Tibetan Gelugpa tradition that takes as central the commentaries of D. Gudun Grub, Mkaz Grubar J.E., and especially, J.E. Tsongkhapa. My interpretation of the text reflects not only Candrakirti's and J.E. Tsongkhapa's commentaries, but also the extended oral commentary I have received on this text from the eminent Tibetan Madhyamaka scholars, especially the Venerable Professor Geshe Yeshas Thapkaz of the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies and the Venerable Professor Jen Lobsang Gyatso of the Institute of Buddhist Dialectics. I should point out that both of these scholars as well as others to whom I am indebted for valuable conversations, including the Most Venerable Professor Samdhong Rinpoche and the Venerable Geshe Namgyal Wangchen, received their education at Drepung Losling Monastic College, and so my interpretation also reflects more particularly the academic tradition of that institution. Having characterized this as a tradition of interpretation, I must emphasize that it is not, as it is often represented, and as it often represents itself, a homogeneous tradition. Though there is a hermeneutic convention in Indo-Tibetan Buddhist literature of presenting oneself as merely expounding faithfully the views of all of the earlier commentators, this is almost never the truth. There are considerable divergences in interpretation and in philosophical position within Buddhist schools and within lineages. Indeed, the Tibetan scholars I have regularly consulted, despite the fact that they shared many of the same teachers and an identical curriculum, differ widely among themselves on many issues. It would hence be impossible in any case to represent accurately the Prasangikamadhyamaka interpretation, or even the Gelugpa interpretation or the Drepung Losling interpretation of Mulamadhyamakarika. I emphasize that even if one could identify such a homogeneous interpretation, I am not here presenting the interpretation or interpretations of any of these commentators or scholars, individually or collectively. There are substantial debates within these traditions regarding interpretative issues, and I do not consistently side with any particular faction, though I do think that it is true that my reading never conflicts directly with that of Candrakirti. Sometimes, as in my reading of the final chapter, I depart from the most common Gelugpa interpretation entirely in favor of a line more closely associated with the Nyingmapa reading of the text. Nor is the purpose of this text to compare, criticize, and resolve differences between interpretations. Instead, I here present the text as I read it, having been influenced by all of these commentators and teachers, and as I present it to my Western colleagues. And my intention in doing so is to let the text stand alone as a work of philosophy valuable in its own right to anyone interested in fundamental metaphysical, epistemological, and soteriological questions, not as a text to be studied only as part of the history of philosophy or comparative philosophy. Moreover, my exposition will be deliberately sympathetic. My goal is not to assess Nagarjuna's philosophy, but to present and elucidate it and to do so in a way that, while making the text accessible to Western philosophers, does not disguise the fact that the text made accessible is an early Indian Madhyamaka philosophical treatise.